Hi, this is Kelsey, and in this video we're going to be looking closely at the bureaucracy as implementers, as well as some of the criticisms levied against the bureaucracy. So here is our learning objective. And if you recall that when we talk about the bureaucracy, a lot of their power depends on how much discretionary authority Congress is providing them with. When the law is written by Congress, and if it's written in ambiguous and unclear and non-specific type of terms, this typically is going to provide the bureaucracy with a lot of leverage and a lot of discretion. Because remember that the bureaucracy is responsible for the nuts and bolts of executing these policies made by Congress specifically, sometimes the president with executive orders, and then other times with the Supreme Court when you see orders coming down from the courts that involve judicial activism. Now, with respect to implementation, of course, they are responsible for creating and assigning an agency the policy. On top of that, they have to translate what does this policy that Congress just passed. We have to create rules and regulations and forms. So if we're going to be passing a law that says clean air, well, what does this mean for businesses? How do we regulate them? Which rules should we be creating to adhere to this policy that Congress just created? They also have to coordinate resources. One of the biggest problems with resources is that they are finite. You don't have an infinite number of people to enforce the law. So they have to get resources, especially for compliance monitoring, and that's very important. But keep in mind, this is the stage with respect to implementation of policymaking that takes place between the establishment and consequences of a policy. So they're thinking, how are we going to translate this policy to affect people, and hopefully, of course, for the better. But sometimes it can fail. Why? Because how it's designed by Congress can be flawed. So if you have a flawed program, you're probably not going to be doing all that much good. In addition, sometimes there's a lack of clarity. Congressional laws are ambiguous, they're imprecise, they're non-specific, and while that can give you a lot of discretion, at other times it can be confusing as to what the original intent of Congress was when they crafted that particular law. And then other times you have laws that just simply conflict with each other, so you have to reconcile that. If you don't have enough resources, manpower, money to enforce these policies, that becomes an issue, and as a result, implementation can fail. Now, agencies may be humongous, but again, you may not have enough staff to carry out policy goals. So, for example, the EPA is a pretty sizable agency, but when you create more and more regulations, you may not have enough manpower to really implement that successfully. Now, in terms of lack of resources, certainly there are many different types of resources needed, as we've talked about personnel, but also training. You have to be able to train these regulators as to what they're looking for, how to look for that. Sometimes you will need supplies, and especially equipment when you're inspecting, let's say, for example, facilities. You also may lack the authority to act. It depends upon how Congress granted you authority. Did they grant you enough authority? Was it very minimal? It really depends. And in addition, with respect to routine, there are, of course, standard operating procedures known as SOPs that hopefully are going to bring uniformity to complex organizations. It can be very difficult to change routines as well, especially in a newer era where technology is taking over. So for all of these reasons, sometimes, while the greatest program you think is going to work really well, they fall short. And oftentimes, I would imagine it's due to a lack of resources, especially manpower. In addition, with respect to administrators, excuse me, administrative discretion is also important because the head of that agency is going to have a lot of power in terms of how are we going to enforce this law. Also, your street level bureaucrats, these are the ones who are going out, let's say for OSHA, inspecting workplace facilities. They're going to have a lot of discretion as do we find this person? Is this person up to date with their paperwork? And you tend to see when you don't see those standard operating procedures present, you tend to see a lot more discretion because it gives that regulator a little bit more latitude. Another major problem, and notice I bolded this, is fragmentation. That's where you have policies that Congress has created, but they're spread amongst more than one. So you have some agencies responsible for different rules for the same exact policy. So holding the bureaucracy accountable is very difficult, especially when you've spread it amongst several ones. And a great example of fragmentation is look at all the departments and agencies responsible for border security in 2002. Everyone from the CIA, Department of Agriculture, to the Department of Transportation, the Postal Service, immigration, of course, EPA. All of these are responsible for one, facet of border security policy. So this is fragmentation. How do you hold all of these agencies and cabinets responsible? It's very, very difficult, and oftentimes they're not held responsible. But when you look at a good case study as to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, why did it work really well? Well, it had a clear and concise goal. The implementation was clear to the bureaucracy, and so those carrying out those street bureaucrats had obvious authority to regulate, and they had the vigor to do so. So they had the resources on top of that. So that made the Voting Right Act very successful as a policy. Now, when we talk about deregulation, there's always talk about deregulation of the bureaucracy in Washington. And that, of course, is when you're lifting restrictions on business, industry, and professional activities. So, those who claim that there's too much regulation, they say, well, because you're putting more strings attached on businesses, such as, let's say, they have to curb the amount of pollution, let's say a factory has to, well, in turn, that costs money because you have to invest in new technology. That ultimately is going to lead to an increase in the cost of the commodity prices. You're also going to see that this is going to hurt U.S. competitive position abroad. In China, in India, they may not have these strict regulations like the United States does, and as a result, if you are a company, you might be more prone to buying from India and China, or maybe even moving your jobs over to these locations. So it does not always work well when we look at deregulation. But others are going to argue, yes, you need regulation. Otherwise, businesses would be running amok. They would be polluting the water. They would be taking advantage of employees, working them to death in unsafe areas or unsafe conditions, rather. So, one big thing that Donald Trump has done is cut regulation because, again, he sees this as a burden to businesses. So, again, it comes down to ideology sometimes. Now, with respect to checks on the bureaucracy from the president, certainly appointment power is very important. Your ideology is going to definitely influence who you appoint, because who you appoint is going to really provide them with some discretion as to how they carry out the goals. Good example is Scott Pruitt, the former governor of Oklahoma. He was appointed to the EPA despite the fact that in his position as governor there, he was suing the EPA all the time. And somebody who was against the EPA, interestingly enough, was appointed to the EPA. So, you can see how ideology can work out of course, in this political cartoon, sort of a negative light against him in terms of the EPA looking at coal, oil pollution here. But the president can also issue executive orders, which of course carry the force of law, and they're used to implement policy. So the executive order can direct a particular agency as to how to regulate part of the law a little bit more clearly. And then the president also has the power to reorganize an agency. So a good example of this was after 9/11, George W. Bush created the Department of Homeland Security to sort of bring all these federal agencies together that dealt with homeland security. So certainly the president has that check on the bureaucracy. So these are very important checks that you definitely need to be familiar with. Now, when we look at Congress's checks on the bureaucracy, there are a lot. You have legislative oversight. You have the confirmation of presidential nominees to those regulatory agencies as well as those departments. And then definitely the power of the purse. That's always a check that Congress is going to have. So if it doesn't like an agency, it doesn't even just have to abolish it. It could just simply not fund it. So that's a lot of power right there. They can rewrite legislation, make it more detailed in terms of the law. So they can give the bureaucracy, if they thought, hey, the first time we gave them a little too much discretion, why don't we dial that down a little bit and pass updated legislation? They can certainly do that. And then they, of course, have the abolishment power, where they could just simply get rid of an agency if they wish to. And then the main check that the Supreme Court is going to have on the bureaucracy comes down to judicial review. And that's very similar when we look at the Supreme Court's check on laws passed by Congress and actions done by the president. So that's typically the biggest check that the court is going to have on any one of the branches, including the the bureaucracy. Now, a new term here is something called iron triangles, and this is the idea that there is a dependent relationship between bureaucratic agencies, interest groups, and congressional committees or subcommittees on a specific topic. So they are independent of each other. However, the idea of an iron triangle is that it's very difficult to penetrate. They are tough, not impossible though to get rid of, but typically they are. And I'll show you an example of what an iron triangle looks like in just a moment. But some say that they are being replaced with a wider issue network that focuses on more than one policy. So when you see an iron triangle, you see three parts right here. And for example, if you want to look at tobacco, let's say, why is tobacco still legalized despite the fact that it kills 400,000 people every year? Well, the bureaucracy, in this case the tobacco division in the Department of Agriculture, is going to make rulings on tobacco production. It's going to make rulings on prices. But in turn, the tobacco lobby interest group, which includes farmers and manufacturers, is going to give information about the industry to the bureaucracy, is going to support the agency's budget requests when they're asking for money from Congress. So it's like you scratch my back, I scratch your back. Now with the interest group and the subcommittee's relationship, it's going to be, hey, we're going to give the subcommittee money, for your reelection. We're going to also give you information. In return, the subcommittee is going to pass favorable legislation that affects tobacco farmers and other members of the industry. So again, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. And then between the subcommittee and the bureaucracy, of course, is providing information. It's going to help with constituents' complaints, which, of course, the subcommittee members are all congresspeople. They have constituents. And then in return, you're going to have an approval of a higher budget request. So in all of these relationships, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. So if you're somebody who's trying to make tobacco illegal, good luck trying to get through this very, very tough iron triangle. So that's the idea, that these are very impenetrable, that they cannot be penetrated, and that these three different parts are all dependent upon each other and are tough like an iron. So again, that's one of the reasons why tobacco is still legal here. Again, here's just another example of that. So some believe that iron triangles are a little too simplistic, and that there's a more complicated connection, that there are interest groups from opposite sides of an issue who compete, and really the idea of an issue network is that you should include more members, including the media, on debates and why there's a lot of slow policy making, especially, let's say, with tobacco. So policy making is certainly not as smooth when competing demands from interest groups. Certainly the president can appoint to the agency who steers policy, but trying to control that policy can be a different issue. So this is what an issue network would look like, as you have various players here. So if you're looking at environmental policy, you have a variety of different stakeholders here, from interest groups to cabinets, to executive office agencies here, and they're all competing, and that's why policy really doesn't change, as opposed to the simplistic framework where three people that you can't penetrate here, and thus policy doesn't change. This is sort of the updated idea of an issue network as compared to an iron triangle. So that is where we will stop for today.